साधिभूतादिदैवम्
साधिभूतादिदैवम्
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
प्रयाणकालेऽपि अपि च मां
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां
प्रयाणकालेऽपि च मां
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा ऑनलाइन साधिभूतादिदैवं मां साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा साधिभूतादिदैवं मां साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसः साधिभूतादिदैवं मां साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसः साधिभूतादिदैवं मां
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः
साधियज्ञं च ये विदुः प्रयाणकाले अपि च मां
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा
ते विदुर्युक्तचेतसा. Word to word meaning. Sadhibhuta, the governing principle of the material manifestation. Sa-adhidaivam,
Sadhidaivam,
underlying all the demigods.
underlying all the demigods.
Mam,
Ma,
me.
me.
Sa-adhiyagnam,
Sadhiyajnam,
sustaining all sacrifices.
sustaining all sacrifices.
Cha,
And
ye, those. Viduhu, no. Prayana,
Prayana,
of death.
Kale,
At the time.
Api,
Even. Cha, and. Mam, me. Te,
They,
they. Viduhu,
Viduhu,
no.
No.
Yukta Chetasaha, with steadfast mind.
With steadfast mind.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada.
Jai Srila Prabhupada.
Those who know me as the Supreme Lord, as the governing principle of the material manifestation, who know me as the one underlying all the demigods and as the one sustaining all sacrifices, can, with steadfast mind, understand and know me even at the time of death. Translation with repetition. Those who know me as the Supreme Lord,
As the Supreme Lord,
as a governing principle
as the governing principle
of the material manifestation,
of the material manifestation,
who know me as the one underlying
as the one underlying
all the demigods
all the demigods,
and as the one sustaining
and was
all sacrifices,
all sacrifices,
can, with steadfast mind,
with steadfast mind,
understand
understand
and know me even at the time of death.
even at the time of death.
Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Yes. Persons acting in Krishna consciousness are never entirely deviated from the path of understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the transcendental association of Krishna consciousness, one can understand how the Supreme Lord is the governing principle of the material manifestation and even of the demigods. Gradually, by such transcendental association, one becomes convinced of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself, and at the time of death, such a Krishna conscious person can never forget Krishna. Naturally, thus, he is thus promoted to the planet of the Supreme Lord, Goloka Vrindavana. This seventh chapter particularly explains how one can become a fully Krishna conscious person. The beginning of Krishna consciousness is association of persons who are Krishna conscious. Such association is spiritual and puts one directly in touch with the Supreme Lord. And by His grace, one can understand Krishna to be the Supreme God. At the same time, one can really understand the constitutional position of the living entity and how the living entity forgets Krishna and becomes entangled in material activities. By gradual development of Krishna consciousness and good association, the living entity can understand that due to forgetfulness of Krishna, he has become conditioned by the laws of material nature. He can also understand that this human form of life is an opportunity to regain Krishna consciousness and that it should be fully utilized to attain the causeless mercy of the Supreme Lord. Many subjects have been discussed in this chapter. The man in distress, the inquisitive man, the man in want of material necessities, knowledge of Brahman, knowledge of Paramatma, liberation from birth, death, and diseases, and worship of the Supreme Lord. However, he who is actually elevated in Krishna consciousness does not care for the different processes. He simply directly engages himself in activities of Krishna consciousness and thereby factually attains his constitutional position as eternal servitor of Lord Krishna. In such a situation, he takes pleasure in hearing and glorifying the Supreme Lord in pure devotional service. He is convinced that by doing so, all his objectives will be fulfilled. This determined faith is called Trida Vrita, and is the beginning of Bhakti Yoga or transcendental loving service. That is the verdict of all scriptures. This seventh chapter of the Gita is the substance of that conviction. Thus, N.C. Bhaktivedanta purpose the seventh chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the matter of the knowledge of the Absolute. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Nitinamine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we are discussing the last verse of the 7th chapter, knowledge of the absolute, and it is very important that we also recollect some of the things that we have discussed so far. In fact, Srila Prabhupada is summarizing in the last paragraph of this purport the discussion about the 7th chapter. So maybe before we get into this verse, let us try to just recollect some of the things that we discussed so far in this 7th chapter. So it is very important to note that there are two kinds of knowledge, knowledge of the absolute and knowledge of the relative. Everyone in the world is actually after relative knowledge. So to actually even understand there is something known as knowledge of the absolute, there is something known as absolute truth. And there is knowledge about the absolute truth is a very significant step in the life of individual. Most people are just happy, satisfying knowing what is happening in some other part of the world, what is happening with some other person, what is happening in the gossiping news that comes about. So mostly people are just interested in the relative aspects of this material world. Very few are actually interested in understanding what is the ultimate truth, what is that which is absolutely true, what is that I should actually always seek for. So this understanding that there is something known as absolute truth, and there is knowledge of this absolute truth, and there is a way to know this truth is a significant step for a living entity to make to come to this understanding of how do I acquire this knowledge. So Bhagavad Gita, so someone who's actually inquisitive to know the real knowledge, the absolute knowledge, Bhagavad Gita is presenting, Lord Krishna himself is giving this knowledge of the absolute. Because in this relative world, it is very difficult to make sense of things that there is something known as absolute. Because in the mundane world, our perception of things based upon our senses, our mind is all projecting a certain kind of physical world into our mind. And everything that we understand is based upon this physical sense perception that we have. But sometimes, because of just being too engrossed in this limited understanding of the world through our senses, we forget that there is a deeper reality. There is a reality beyond our senses. There is truth beyond the senses, the knowledge that we acquire with the senses. There is absolute knowledge. There is real truth. And because most people cannot understand that, because many people think that my sensual perception is all in all, and there's nothing, no more truth than this. So they get entrapped by sense gratification, by just enjoying the senses and thinking that this is the highest way of living life. But someone who recognizes that, my way of leading life through sensual pleasures, through mundane pleasures, is not all good. I'm not able to overcome all the sufferings. That's why Sanatana Goswami says, although he was a great minister in the Nawab's kingdom, he says to Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Ke ami kenama tapatreya. People call me to be a great person, but I actually do not know who I am. Why am I suffering all these kinds of various miseries? I have no idea. And therefore, they're falsely calling me to be intelligent, Pandita, but I'm not. So, this understanding to how do I understand my own true nature? How do I understand the nature of the absolute? To come to this, it is not very easy. In fact, it is not possible by our mundane sensual perception or by speculative methods. And therefore, the Lord says there's two methods of knowledge. That is the knowledge obtained by pratyaksha pramana. That is the knowledge obtained by direct perception. So perception using one of our senses. or even mind sometimes. It is not possible to acquire the ultimate knowledge. Similarly, with the case of speculation, speculation does not mean that it is actually truth. Speculation may indicate something, but it is not necessarily meant to be true. But on the other hand, when something is heard from an absolute source, one can understand that the knowledge is absolute. And especially in the case of the knowledge of the absolute, the knowledge has to be received from the absolute source, or from the source which the absolute authorizes one to deliver that message. Therefore, this knowledge of the Supreme Lord has to be understood from the Lord himself or from his bona fide devotee. Therefore, today there's a lot of problem in religious understanding. That is because people do not know where to approach a bona fide devotee. Without approaching a bona fide devotee, it is not possible to understand the words of the Lord, even though there may be people saying that we have the message of the Lord. But unless there is no bona fide devotee, one cannot understand the meaning of those words of the Lord. Or one may not be able to realize in truth, as a fact, what is being said. Because it looks sometimes counterintuitive. Oh, if I surrender to the Lord, I'll overcome all the sufferings. How is that? I'm surrendering to my boss. I'm surrendering to my wife. I'm surrendering to my father, my children. I've done so much of surrender to them, and all they brought to me is miseries. So why should I surrender? It looks counterintuitive for people. People think that if I surrender, someone is going to exploit me. Why should I serve someone? Rather, I follow my own whims and live my life. But therefore, a pure devotee comes, and by seeing the example of a pure devotee, how his pure surrenderance to the Supreme Lord is actually the right way to live life. That is our constitutional position, which is so difficult to understand. It looks counterintuitive for most common people. But actually, that is a blissful life. That's the rightful life for one to live. Just like a servant of a king, if he artificially thinks himself to be king and tries to lead a life, oh, I'm the king, and he travels everywhere, he will be punished for that. He may think, oh, I'm servant, I'm in a lower position, rather I become artificially a king. That is not going to save him. Similarly, artificially, the living entity may think that I am the greatest, I'm the supreme, I can do whatever I'm like, but unfortunately, that's the cause of suffering. So this knowledge of the absolute, the Lord is telling, okay, surrender unto me, I'm the absolute truth, is very difficult to understand for a common man with limited understanding, of the absolute truth, because the living entity is only using one's own senses and speculation to understand. Therefore, the Lord says that Tat Shrinu, the first verse of this chapter begins with the statement Tat Shrinu. That means, now hear, O Arjuna. So the Lord begins this, the first verse. Now hear, O son of Pritha, Arjuna. How by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me, with mind attached to me, you can know me in full, free from doubt. The Lord is saying that the only way you can know me free from doubt. So when we know things, there is always a certain amount of doubt, skepticism. But if one wants to overcome that skepticism, that doubt, to any degree one may have, the best way the Lord is recommending is that we need to hear from Him. So when we hear from Him, one can know the Lord in full, in completeness. To the degree one can understand the Lord, one can understand in totality. By any other means, if one wants to understand God, it is not possible. So the simple way, if anyone calls oneself to be religious, then the first thing is that he must have heard sufficiently from the Lord and his pure devotee. Otherwise, one cannot know the nature of the Lord. The Bhagavad Lakshana, just like everything is determined by its characteristics. Just like an expert miner, when he's traversing the land, he may be able to judge whether this is a land with gold mines or silver mines or limestone mine? What kind of a mine is this? An expert miner can be able to judge. A common man will not be able to judge. So unless one is not an expert to understand the characteristics of something, he will be cheated. The another example can that be of the gold. Unless one does not know how to understand whether the gold is pure gold or a rolled gold, unless one is not having knowledge of the characteristics of a pure gold, it's like the pure gold has a certain density, it has certain characteristics of luster, so it has got a certain color, it's got so and so properties. A person who has understood the characteristics of that can understand, oh yes, this is the right product that I'm looking for. Otherwise, appearingly it may look like gold, but actually it may not be gold. It may be titanium nitride coating or some other coating with some paint. Therefore, in order to understand the characteristics of the Lord, also known as Bhagavata Lakshana, one has to hear from the Lord himself. What are these characteristics? How should I know him? How should I see him? How can I see him? Those characteristics, and who is God? What are his characteristics? That I can only know when I hear from the Lord. And therefore, this verse is saying, if you want to understand the Lord in full and free from doubt, then one must hear from him. That is the first principle. And then in the very beginning, Lord describes that there are two kinds of knowledge. One is phenomenal and one is nominal. So phenomenal knowledge is the knowledge which is visible to us, which is what is appearing to us, but there is knowledge beyond what it appears to us, called nominal knowledge. And that knowledge, if one were to acquire and see what is the substance behind the form which is appearing to us, one has to hear, one has to have the Shastra Chakshu, one has to have the scriptural understanding. Without that, one cannot make sense of the things in totality. That's why the whole world is revolving in speculation, because by any amount of mental jugglery or sensual information one obtains, one cannot connect all the dots. But just because I do not know, people in the propensity to cheat, they misguide the living entity to rephrase the question to something else and divert his attention to something else and leave him from the important question that is at the table to be discussed about the absolute truth. So the Lord is saying there are two kinds of knowledge, but if you hear from me, these both kind of knowledge, you will be able to understand both the phenomenal and the nominal. And it is also very important in the very next verse, in the third verse, Lord says, out of thousands among men, one may endeavor for perfection. And of those who have achieved perfection, hardly one knows me in truth. So there are various gradations of people. Although when we say, who are you? People usually say, I'm a human being. But not that all human beings are of one kind. There are so many gradations. In the modern world, the gradation of people is based upon money. Are you a rich man, poor man? Are you from a developing country, developed country, or a poor country? Or some other external labels that people put to classify people on various categories. But here's an interesting category. How many are people are actually endeavoring for perfection of life? And how many are not? Nice categorization. And among them, whoever achieved perfection, here the perfection is kind of liberation or the understanding of the self, but not the complete understanding of the absolute truth, the Supreme Lord. So if you just categorize people, how many are endeavoring for perfection? How many have achieved perfection? And in that perfection stage, actually to understand who is the absolute truth, it's a very, very rare thing. And therefore, it is so important that the devotees of the Lord are respected so much, because they are just like, we find someone rare person who is highly elevated in the material sense, we give him so much respect, so much attention. But here, the pure devotees of the Lord have attained perfection, not only in terms of knowing that they're not this body, but even in terms of knowing who the Supreme Lord is and how to act in relationship with the Supreme Lord. And therefore, how rare they are and how important they are. And then Lord goes on further to say that how one can see the Lord in this phenomenal world. because the Lord, as we know, is present in the spiritual world. But how about in this world? Is he not present? Then, as we see in the next few verses, from the verse 4 to 5, the Lord explains that how earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego, all this together comprise, these 8 comprise my separated material energies. So when we see this world, we may see that there is no presence of the Lord. But as we see in this verse, in the last verse, it is very much said that the governing principle of the manifestation, those who know me as the governing principle of the material manifestation, even for this material world to manifest and for this material world to move, firstly the material world has to be created. It has to be manifested in a certain form. After manifestation, it has to function in a certain form. And the prime mover of all these things is the Supreme Lord Himself. Because these things that we see which are moving and interacting are nothing but His energies. Earth, water, fire, air, ether, we see there's no connection. No, but these are all the energies of the Lord. And so is the living entity, who is also a part of the Supreme Lord, but this living entity is also said to be of inferior nature. These 8 energies are said to be inferior energy or inferior nature of the Supreme Lord's energies. And slightly higher than this is the living entity, who is above the material energies, which are described in the previous verse of 8 kinds. The living entity is the marginal energy of the Supreme Lord. The living entity has the ability to control the lower 8 forms of energies. But the living entity can also be controlled, can come under the control of these 8 energies, and therefore the living entity is marginal energy, although superior to the this 8 material energies of the Lord. And then one may question, if the living entity can be come under the influence of the material energy, what is the nature of the Lord? There it is mentioned that the Lord is beyond these 2 categories of lower inferior energy, that is 8 separated energies, and the living entity, who is also a Prakriti, but slightly above the material 8 forms of material energy. The Lord is of another category. And he says, Matta Paradaram Nanyat Kinchit Asti Dhananjaya. There is no truth superior to me. The category of the Supreme Lord is that He is the source of both the material and the spiritual worlds. He is the absolute truth, the ultimate truth, who is the source of everything. And therefore, His characteristics are very much different. And as we see, His presence in this material world can also be seen by the various examples that Lord Krishna gives us as how should we see Him. I'm the taste of the water. I'm the light of the sun and the moon. I'm the sound in ether and ability in man. So when we see these things, when we taste water, when we see every day, morning and evening, we see light. And that light is actually coming, I'm the light of the sun and the moon. And therefore, in various ways, the Lord gives us various examples by which we have to see how is the fragrance, original fragrance of the earth, heat in fire. Tomorrow we are going to have some bonfire. So I'm the heat in fire. I'm the life of all that lives, and I'm the penance of all ascetics. So in this way, the Lord goes on to explain how one can perceive the Lord in different aspects of this existence, material existence. And then one, as I said before, that the Lord being the absolute truth, who is beyond these 2 categories of inferior material energies and the marginal living entity, the Lord, although He is the creator of these 3 modes of material nature, He is never under them. And therefore, He never comes under the control of these material energies. So the material energy means it does not have consciousness, it is full of ignorance. The Supreme Lord is full of knowledge, is full of pure knowledge. Therefore, it's never influenced by this lower material energy, which is full of ignorance. Whereas marginal living entity, he can come under the influence of the material energy. And Lord goes on to state that why is that people are not able to understand the Supreme Lord? People may say, why don't you show me God? Where is God? And that is the reason, Tribir Gunamair Bhaver Epi Sarvamidam Jagat Mohitam Na Vijanati Mam Epya Paramavayam. Deluded by the three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, the whole world does not know me, who am above the modes and inexhaustible. So, when I'm covered by illusion, it is very difficult for me to make sense of things which are beyond illusion. And when the covering of the material energy is present in the living entity is not able to perceive what exists beyond the material influence. And therefore, the living entity is always enamored by this material energy and forgets the nature of the Supreme Lord, the existence of the Supreme Lord. So if that is the case, what is the way out? The Lord explains that although I can be perceived everywhere, but because of being materially entrapped by these different modes of material nature, one is not able to see me. And therefore, Lord says, Daivi Yasha Gunamayi Maya Duratyaya Mam Evaye Prapatyante Maya Metam Tarantiti. It is very, this Daivi Yasha Gunamayi, this material energy is also my energy. It's the divine energy of mine. It is very difficult to overcome this energy. But one can overcome this energy if one surrenders unto me. If one surrenders unto the Supreme Lord, one can easily cross over this influence of the material energy. Without that, it is not possible for one to overcome the influence of the material energy. So this is a very important point, that unless I do not overcome the influence of the material energy, three modes of material nature, which is so difficult to overcome, and it is only possible by taking shelter, by surrendering unto the Supreme Lord. Now, then one may question who surrenders and who does not surrender to the Supreme Lord. So next few verses, there are four kinds of people who do not surrender to the Lord. Who are those? Namam Dushritina Mudaha. Mudaha, foolish people. They just want to work hard like an ass, simply working hard. They have no intelligence. They have no idea of what they should do in their life. They're simply working hard to get some grass, just like a donkey. But grass is available everywhere. But being foolish, Mudaha. Prapadyante Naradamaha. Naradama, the lowest of mankind. Maya Pritajnana Ashrimbham Ashrita. So there are people who are whose knowledge is stolen by illusion. They may be so-called great philosophers, so-called great thinkers, so-called great leading men of a society of different kinds, but their knowledge is stolen by illusion. That means they cannot see what is actually true. They assume something to be true, but they do not know that is not actually true. And therefore, you can see there are great so-called speakers, so-called atheistic scientists, so-called philosophers, so-called psychologists, so-called lawyers, so-called politicians. They may tend to speak so nicely, but they're assuming something to be something else, and therefore they're filled with illusion, but acting like they are smart people. And because they are thinking they're smart people, they do not want to surrender unto a higher principle, or the higher truth of the Supreme Personality of God and His teachings. Similarly, there are some people who are atheistic, who has got this tendency that I would want to oppose everything which is said to be true, which is religious, which is righteous. I do not accept anything that you say is to be right, except only what I think is to be right. So people are like this. So when one has got these kind of tendencies, this kind of nature, then one is not able to surrender to the Supreme Lord. Then there are four kinds of people who surrender to the Lord. Who are those four kinds of people? These four kinds of people surrender not out of full knowledge. but they have a certain motivation behind why they want to worship the Lord or take to devotional service. So these four kinds of pious men who can render service to the Supreme Lord are Artho, Artharthi, Jignasur, Gnani. So because someone is in distress, someone comes to the temple. I want to avoid from the distress. I'm extremely pained in my life right now. I do not know what to do. I see no help from around. I come and take shelter of the Lord. But it so happens when the pain goes away, it's possible that the person also goes away from the temple. No more, I no more require God. I require God only when there is pain. So there is an exchange here. I do devotional service, I worship you, I pray to you, and then when it goes away, the suffering, I go back. There's a tendency. And therefore, they're not to be classified as the highest class of devotees. But still, Prabhupada says it's much better to go to the Supreme Lord than to go anywhere else, even if it means that I want something. And that's what even Bhagavatam says. Then there are people who are in need of money, in need of wealth. And they think, oh, if I do this puja to the Lord, I can get a job. Maybe my salary may increase. Maybe I may get some other beautiful wife, something else. And therefore I come and worship the Lord because I can gain something. Then there is people who are inquisitive, who wants to know things as they are, and they recognize maybe I should go to the Lord and learn more the philosophy that is given by the Lord, the teachings given by the Lord, but the interest is something else. Then Gnani means, Jignasu means one who is inquisitive, and Gnani means one who wants to know the things as they are. So in this way, a person who wants to know as they are things, trying to identify the truth, may also come to the Lord. So amongst all these categories of people, Lord says that that the Gnani is better than the other three, and but amongst all of this, even better is one who is situated in knowledge of me, who understands the position of the Lord and why one should render service unto him. A person who is engaged in devotional service with this kind of knowledge, Lord says that Eva Anuttamam Gatim, he attains the highest destination. That means he attains the Supreme Lord. So, having said that, the 19th verse of this chapter explicitly talks about who are the great souls or the Mahatmas. So it says, Bahunam Janmanam Ante Jnanavan Mam Prapatyati Vasudeva Sarvamiti Sa Mahatma Sudurlabhaha. After many births and deaths, he was actually in knowledge, surrenders unto me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes and all that is. Such a great soul is very rare. So here is perfection of surrender. So there are different kinds of surrender, but the perfection of surrender is that where one knows the Lord as the cause of all causes and completely surrenders to the Supreme Lord, knowing this to be the nature of the Lord, who is the Supreme Lord. But then, starting from the verse 20 to 23, there is a description about there are people who might surrender, but they may not surrender to the Supreme Lord. So whom do they surrender? They surrender to demigods. They think, okay, and if I have to surrender to someone, why don't I surrender to demigods? And these people surrender because they may get some immediate benefits. Because surrendering unto the Supreme Lord means undergoing some form of purification, undergoing, it may take some time to actually reach the Param Gati, the highest destination, the highest goal to attain the Supreme Lord. But sometimes people may think, why not I get something immediately? Shortcut. So I worship some demigod, and the demigods will fulfill my material desire, or I may get, as we see, that whatever consciousness at which one leaves the body, he actually reaches that planet. So maybe I will reach some demigod's planet. Maybe I can live for a longer time. I may enjoy longer life. And but it is also said the Lord says that this is not very intelligent desire. This is not very intelligent surrender, because the benefits are limited and temporary. So who is anyone who is very intelligent will not ask for something which is limited and temporary. If I can get so much unlimited wealth, unlimited happiness, why would someone satisfy with very limited things? But in this material calculation, we think in this way. Even in material things, we want to acquire more and more. But going back to spiritual world means to overcome all the miseries and to find true existence, blissful life. If that is available, if one is asking for anything lesser, that means one is to be considered not very intelligent. Therefore, Lord says that this is not very intelligent to worship the Supreme Lord, because the fruits are limited and temporary. God also says that in fact it is me who strengthens the faith in someone to worship the demigods. Even that the faith that to worship in a specific demigod is coming from me. And the benefits that also one is receiving from the demigods is actually given by me. And therefore, someone who's very intelligent can see that when I'm receiving the benefits from the Lord is the one who's increasing my faith. And he is the one who can give me the highest benefit. Why not I directly worship him? So therefore, this argument of worshiping demigods as how it is not the highest is also mentioned here. Then there are another class of people who think that surrender means the Lord has assumed the form of impersonal. The supreme absolute truth is actually impersonal, and the Lord has only assumed a form when he comes to this material world, and therefore I should worship that thing which is inside the Lord, or that which is impersonal form of the absolute. So there is another class of people who think that is the highest goal of life. Surrender should be that I become also one with that. So this kind of understanding people may have, and the Lord says even that is not the right kind of understanding of the surrender or understanding of its own nature. And then Lord explains that that the Lord is not manifest to the foolish and the unintelligent, because he is covered by his yoga maya potency. So because the Lord reserves a right to whom he wants to be revealed. It is not by one's own individual attempts of some sort of speculation or some yogic exercises that one can understand the nature of the Lord. It is by his own mercy that the Lord reveals himself. And that is not possible for someone who is foolish. And starting verse 26, how the bewilderment can go away of the living entity of worshipping different forms of different demigods or the impersonal Brahman, and how actually one can overcome the bewilderment of dualities. How does that happen? So Lord explains again by saying that his nature is very different from that of the living entity. The living entity, the Lord knows the past, present, and the future, and the living entity does not know the Supreme Lord. It is full of ignorance. And therefore, there's this distinction that I need to understand that if I want to overcome bewilderment, if I want to overcome the delusion of this material world and my life, then I need to know the Supreme Lord and take to shelter. And I should also know what's my specific nature even further. And why am I put into this bewilderment? And therefore, Lord says that I have been put into this bewilderment because of my desire and hate, Icha and Dvesha. So because of that, I've been put into this delusion. And it is not that only one person is put into delusion. All the living entities in the material world are put into this delusion, are born with this delusion. And that is because of the nature, because of the desire and hate that they have developed. So as we saw, that the desire is to become like Krishna and becoming envious of Krishna for the kind of opulences he has got, for the kind of services he's being receiving from different devotees, Mother Lakshmi, and so on and so forth. So because of this, the living entity thinks, oh, I should also be worshipped like that. I should also become Krishna. And therefore, the living entity is put in this delusion. And what is the way to come out of this delusion? When one starts acting piously, it's said both in the previous life and in this life, and who has completely eradicated and freed from all the sins, then one can be freed from the duality of delusion. And after that, one can engage in service of the Lord. So, as we saw in this previous verse, that intelligent persons who are endeavoring for liberation from old age and death take refuge in me in devotional service. They're actually Brahman because they entirely know everything about transcendental and fruitive activities. So, we saw how someone who is much more intelligent understands that the struggle for existence in the form of birth, death, old age, and disease is something that I need to overcome. And the Lord is saying that if one is intelligent enough to understand that I want to overcome this, the actual shelter is the Supreme Lord Himself, and by engaging in His devotional service. And this verse, which is the last verse of this chapter, the Lord is further emphasizing that at the point of death, prayana kale apichama te vidur yukta chetasaha. So, as we know, as we'll see in the next chapter, in fact, all these words which are used by Lord Krishna here, Adibhuta, Adidaivam, Adiyajnam, Prayanakale. So, all these words, Arjuna will be asking in more detail. What are all these words mean? And the Lord here is saying that at the time of death, one can know me. One can know the Lord even at the point of death, when one knows that the Supreme Lord is the governing principle of the material manifestation. So He gives 3 points. The Lord gives that if one is with steadfast mind, one can know the Lord at the point of death. If one knows that the Lord is the governing principle of the entire manifestation, He is the underlying principle of all the demigods, and He is the one who sustains all sacrifices. So Adi Bhutam, that's a material manifestation. Adi Daivam, all the demigods, and Adi Yajnam, that means sustaining all sacrifices. So whose consciousness is absorbed in this thought that this Lord is the governing principle of all these things, then at the point of death, one can also be conscious of the Supreme Lord. So one important principle to note is that our consciousness is usually occupied with so many mundane things that are happening around us in the material world. And therefore, it requires great amount of training for us to divert our attention, our consciousness from this material mundane things to the Supreme Lord. And therefore, this process of devotional service is by which we come in association with the Lord. We divert our attention from the material world to the Supreme Lord. And as Kunti Maharani prays, that just like how the river Ganges flows down, similarly my consciousness be attached to the lotus feet of the Lord. So that is a very important process. So how do I understand the Lord as the governing principle, Lord as the underlying principle of all the demigods, Lord as the sustaining factor of all the sacrifices? So that can happen. Prabhupada says, Prabhupada emphasizes on the association of devotees. The beginning of Krishna consciousness is association of persons who are Krishna conscious. So Prabhupada is emphasizing the purport that if really one wants to learn this art of fixing one's consciousness on the Supreme Lord, then the first and most significant step is association of devotees, association of persons who are Krishna conscious. And Prabhupada is saying that such association is actually spiritual. It is not material. Why is it spiritual? Because in that such association, one is becoming conscious of the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada is even saying that such association is spiritual and puts one directly in touch with the Supreme Lord. So the association of the pure devotees is such that by their association, one comes directly in touch with the Supreme Lord, just like the Acharyas have given us the holy name, they have given Srimad Bhagavatam, which are all nothing but the incarnation of the Lord, the beautiful deities. So they are all incarnation of the Lord. So the pure devotees of the Lord are helping us to come in direct contact with the Lord. And therefore, their association, their Vani, is so important. And by His grace, one can understand Krishna to be the Supreme Lord. So without the mercy of the pure devotee and without their grace, it is not possible for us to understand who is the Supreme Lord. And in fact, in one time, Srila Prabhupada, so Prabhupada always liked to have conversation with his disciples. And sometimes he would even debate with them. He would take one side one time and another side another time. So in this way, he would ask various questions sometimes very simple questions and sometimes very complex questions. The devotees were always sometimes, they were hesitant to answer because they used to think, if I answer this, Prabhupada will refute something else. So they would be very careful to answer. So once Prabhupada asked, who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead? So all the devotees were a bit surprised. Is Prabhupada asking some tricky question here? If I tell something, will Prabhupada say something? So they were looking at each other, and then Prabhupada again asked, who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead? And the second time Prabhupada asked, one of the devotees said, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But then Prabhupada asked, do you really, are you having full faith in what you're saying? Are you fully confident? And basically, Prabhupada was trying to make this point that although we may say that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but we all may have different degrees of faith, different degrees of understanding that actually Krishna is the Supreme Absolute Truth. Krishna is actually the source of all demigods. He is the source of all material manifestation. He is to be worshipped by all sacrifices. To different degrees, each one may have the faith and understanding. So this devotee, when he recollects, he says, there is very striking. Yes, I mean, theoretically one may understand, yes, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but do I really have full faith? Do I really understand? And that understanding comes by this gradual process of performing devotional service. So Prabhupada says, gradually by such transcendental association, one becomes convinced of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. So this association with the pure devotee of the Lord and the process that is given, by such association, one becomes convinced. So to become fully convinced, free from doubt, that requires this association with the pure devotee of the Lord. And by following the process that is given by Him, through which we come in contact directly with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When we undergo that, then our conviction, yes, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and I should render service unto Him, becomes completely clear. And when one develops such kind of faith, then even at the point of death, one can remember the Lord. And Prabhupada writes, and at the time of death, such a Krishna conscious person who has actually had the gradually by the transcendental association with the pure devotee, who becomes convinced that the Supreme Lord is Krishna, that such a person, even at the point of death, can never forget Krishna, and naturally is promoted to the planet of Goloka Vrindavana. So this importance of transcendental association with the pure devotee of the Lord is so significant. And without that, this ultimate conviction that the Krishna is absolutely the Supreme Personality of God with no doubt is not possible otherwise. And Prabhupada goes on to say that by gradual development of Krishna consciousness and good association, the living entity can understand that due to forgetfulness of Krishna, he has become conditioned by the laws of material nature. So basically, Prabhupada is trying to say that this 7th chapter, which is explains the nature of Krishna consciousness, so the different aspects of the conditioning the existence of the living entity, be it conditioning, the forgetfulness of the Supreme Lord, all these things will become clear. You will understand, why am I here? What is happening here? What is that is to be known? Where am I supposed to go? What is that I'm supposed to do? All things will become clear by good association. So again and again, Prabhupada is trying to emphasize that simply by having this good association of a person who is Krishna conscious, one can understand all the necessary truths, all the aspects of the Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada goes on to explain that the last paragraph of the purport, that many subjects have been discussed in this chapter. The man in distress, the inquisitive man, the man in want of material necessities, knowledge of Brahman, knowledge of Paramatma, liberation from birth, death, and diseases in worship of the Supreme Lord. However, he who is actually elevated in Krishna consciousness does not care for the different processes. He simply directly engages himself in activities of Krishna consciousness and thereby factually attains his constitutional position as eternal servant of Lord Krishna. So Prabhupada is emphasizing and helping us understand that there may be different kinds of people who surrender in different ways, understand different aspects of the absolute truth, but the highest amongst all of them is actually to understand the supremacy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and to render service unto him. And simply by engaging oneself in the activities of Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada is saying, one factually attains his constitutional position. That is, so this process of engaging oneself in the activities of Krishna consciousness is meant to purify our consciousness and bring to our original state of consciousness, which is not possible by any other means. And the so-called slow processes can take us up to a certain point, but not to this point of actually bringing us to our original constitutional position where one can experience happy, blissful life. And Prabhupada is saying that when one comes to this constitutional position, one of the characteristics of a person who is actually in the constitutional position is that one relishes hearing and glorifying the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is immersed in such blissful activity of devotional service that he becomes more and more inclined simply by glorifying the Lord, simply by hearing about the Lord. And Prabhupada says that he becomes, his faith becomes determined faith, Dridavrittaha. He's no more fluctuating. He is firmly fixed in this absolute truth. He's fixed in Krishna as the Supreme Lord, engaging in the devotional service is highest perfection, and hearing and glorifying the Lord is the highest blissful activity. And Prabhupada is saying the 7th chapter of the Gita is the substance of that conviction. So this 7th chapter of Gita is meant to help us understand that fundamental conviction that by serving the Supreme Personality of Godhead in full surrender, knowing his position is the highest perfection of life. And Prabhupada is concluding that is the substance of this chapter to get that conviction. I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments. If there are no questions or comments, we'll start. Krantaraj Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande.